For the benefit of time, I would like to start with this last session of the day. And first of all, welcome our three distinguished speakers. Maybe Jan, if you are able to put your camera, that would be great. Thank you. So I'm going to start with Norela Constantinescu, who is head of innovation at ENSOE, and who will bring us also the perspective of the TSOs on the debate. Jochen Kreusel, who is the global head of market innovation at ABB Hitachi Power Grids, and will bring us also the perspective of the technology providers, the ones who are involved on developing the projects with the technology. And finally, Jan Kostevk, I hope I pronounce your name half right, at least, who brings us the perspective of the regulators, and Jan is officer on infrastructure regulation. He can tell us all about power grids regulation and investments. So very good. We do not have a set of slides. I think that's good after having seen so many for a bit of breathing time as well on this workshop. We're gonna bring a perspective a bit more on the regulatory environment. Yeah, I mean, we've looked at the technologies that the colleagues just in the previous session have talked us through. So there is plenty of technology ready to be deployed. We said in the morning we need to accelerate the investments in the grids. We need to double them already in this decade, but that's actually not happening. We're not investing enough. It does not seem like we are going to be investing enough in the next couple of years. So maybe let's start with that question, and I will start with you, Johan. Yeah, um, what can we do to accelerate these investments, both for onshore and offshore?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here, having invited me. Just we didn't check it before. Sound works, I guess, because you're not indicating anything different. So I think I would like to reconnect to one thing that has been mentioned by you and also already repeatedly in the previous panels. Well, speed is the key challenge, and we are, and I think we need to acknowledge in what we're doing that this transition is an exceptional situation where all the patterns of thinking, the frameworks we have designed, the proven and successful approaches we had in the past, maybe not perfectly fitting. So we had comments in the chats already before, and it has been mentioned that, for instance, our process to make our mind whether a technology is mature or not takes a lot of time, which had its merits in the past, but it may be a conflict with what we're expecting now. So that is a general theme, which I think all what we are discussing will have to be checked against. In this first part, I think we're talking about planning and deployment. And here I would also like to mention one thing, or just to acknowledge also, planning of particular transmission grids is a I would say exceptionally well structured and defined process in Europe, even across in the complexity of all the states being electrically connected. So I think this is a real benchmark in the world, having such a planning process, and it has evolved over the past a little bit more than 10 years. In fact, it began politically with the third energy package. Of course, network operators were planning also before, but the political framework was developed by then. And I think this is remarkable. However, there is still some homework to be done. So I think we still need to have a more holistic view generally, which means more European. We still plan and develop this system as, I would say, very well structured, coordinated, mutually cooperating national systems, while at the same time we know that particular renewables with their concentration of generation in preferable locations, particularly offshore, is I think the biggest cluster we're talking about, is anything else than nationally structured. So I think that is one of the big changes. So there is certainly room for improvement, having a more holistic view. Having a more holistic view also includes looking beyond electricity, having an integrated view of the total energy system, because we are talking about sector integration. We are talking about substitution of secondary energies, primarily towards electrification. Of course, this has consequences for the infrastructure and requires a holistic view. And I would also say holistic with regard to geographies, so both national coordination, but also coordinating the onshore and the offshore part. Currently, we treat them as different worlds, but we know, well, electrically they are one. We may like it or not. And I guess as we all want to have electrification, we better like it. Uh,
Okay, thanks a
and
lot, Johan, for these
yeah,
initial remarks. Maybe just to give also the
yeah,
floor, Norela, if you would like to add the perspective from the TSOs.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for this invitation. I will just maybe complement of what was said by Johan. Of course, there is this development which is mainly related to DC and AC, so we have to integrate these parts. Of course, we also have to talk about the public acceptance and the permitting, which becomes a barrier. And there probably, there are certain initiatives which involve actually the implication of the stakeholders and also of the citizens at the development of this planning process. And there are certain examples in certain countries where, for example, the CBA is looking not only at the costs and benefits as such, but also at the cost of actually delaying those investments. And maybe if you take into account the overall cost as such, so even more expensive solutions might prove beneficial for the development of the grid. And I would like to come back to one statement made by Johan. So, of course, there is this one system view approach where probably, for example, especially for the offshore development, we have to take into account the regional cooperation and also, I would say, the market design. So, for example, for the wholesale market to allow actually the offshore players to have access to the flexibility which are on the onshore for their head or intraday markets, and on the other hand, to enable actually the offshore players to play in the balancing market. So there is also the market design perspective, which I would like to mention.
Okay, thanks a lot, Norela. Jan, do you have anything to add from also from the regulatory perspective?
Well, this might not sound too regulatory from me, but yeah, maybe from a general point of view, what I would say is the need to sort of build as a foundation for the future grid development is trust. And then in that sense, I think transparency of decision making, I think this is very important. Which means that we do have to go to the fundamentals of the CBAs and so on. But yeah, this is a big but now, because the need for new infrastructure is so huge that we cannot only look at the past and see what can be improved in the processes we used until now. As mentioned by Johan, yeah, we also need to look beyond just electricity. We need to look at potentially hydrogen or anything else. We need to be very cross-sectoral to meet these demands. And in that respect, I think I would maybe also turn our view to public acceptance. We have to take public acceptance on board as one of the major, let's say, facilitators of either building or not building the infrastructure. So maybe building a pipeline or reusing an existing pipeline is that much easier, even though not cost effective. Compared to building a new electrical transmission line, for example. Yeah. So all of these needs to be taken into account in a very holistic way, in a very transparent way, in a very inclusive way. And this, I think, is a very huge thing to overcome, very huge hurdle, let's say, in front of us. We have to start thinking, I think, very, very broadly and differently compared to how we have done it in the past. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's very helpful. So in one hand, we need to accelerate, and then on the other hand, we need to have more transparency on how these cost-benefit analyses are done. And what you're saying as well is that, and also Norella, you mentioned public acceptance, how to integrate that aspect, which could also delay your project, which could also derive to more costs into your whole assessment. And I think we are far from having an integrated assessment where you put all the pieces of the puzzle together and it turns you a result, yeah, of what is the best investment to do. So I guess, and also in line with the first session of the day, we need much more money for innovation, which goes also into improving all these processes. And I think we need to do that pretty fast. Okay, so maybe moving to a different point. So we have agreed, okay, we need to build the grid. We actually know which grid we want to build, interconnector from point A to point B. We know how much capacity we need to put in the system from renewables, and we know the demand, which will be electric by which years. So we seem to know what the map looks like. But something that we do not always address in the detail is what are the different functionalities of the different components of that grid. Yeah. So how much ours is expected from a specific device or from a connecting, let's say, wind farm, offshore or onshore? Yeah. Well, how much we talk about grid forming before? Yeah, as an example. So maybe just start with you, Norella. How do you see this? And do you also expect that these systems will eventually, sorry, these services will eventually also be paid for going forward?
Um, Thank you, Daniel. So we insisted on this acceleration, so the need to accelerate actually this deployment, and of course, there it's important actually to move probably to other types of connection, which I think it was mentioned in the previous session. If I take the example of course, of the offshore deployment, so there we need to move from concept point of view from this radial connection to more the hybrid developments. So connection points which are interconnectors, but also connect the wind farms. And of course, there I think it was mentioned by Willem in the previous session. So there it's important actually to look at HVDC technologies, which is based on converters offering, of course, services. But there, the question is related how actually we put in place such a starting point in order, for example, to have the deployment of meshed offshore grids. So it's again coming to the previous question about the infrastructure. And what is important, I think it was mentioned before, for example, the grid forming capability. But what we need is actually to ensure the interoperability. First of all, the interoperability of all these components, the cost efficiency and the scalability of the solutions. Acting in the multi-vendor and multi-terminal, so connecting different countries together. This, I think, requires, first of all, that, for example, detailed specifications are made at the design and the planning stage. Performing actually studies, and I think it was mentioned in the previous panel, as well as simulation models for this dynamic performance, which is brought by the deployment of this type of devices. And of course, to look at the demonstrator as such, and then to the scalability of the solution. So if I'm going to say a few words more, so we have to look at the interoperability actually of the technology, but also at interoperability between the different manufacturers. And what is important is that we look at the HVDC development from connection requirements on the DC side. So we had AC, so the HVDC code connection requirements on AC side, so we need to look at the DC side. And of course, the functionalities and capabilities are for those for the stability of of the grid, as well as the operational requirements which have to be put in place. So if
Okay.
I could add this.
Thanks a lot, Norella. Jochen, I mean, Norella just mentioned we need to move the grid connections from AC now to apply them on DC. So, from a supplier of technology which needs to develop tomorrow's devices, do you have clarity on actually what those grid connection requirements will be, and how you trying to solve that actually?
Well, this is thank you. This is a very good example. I think it's a good example how what needs to be done also. Although I would say it's also an example from which we can learn what could be done even better. So I would say it's a semi or maybe even three-quarters positive example. We have a very good cooperation here since some time with between the industry of the technology providers, and let me shortly change my head from representing only one of these companies to the association TNT Europe. It's the Association of the European Technology Providers, and we have a very close cooperation with NCOE and those members of NCOE who are mostly affected at the moment by this question on getting this issue solved, for developing functional requirements, making, as Wilhelm Winter, who is one of the key drivers of this process, said before, making DC as simple as AC. And it's an interesting learning experience because the longer we are talking, the more questions we detect, not in the sense unexpected things. I don't want to raise concerns here. It's more of understanding the problems and the challenge of the other side, which I believe is an extremely important process to solve that. So I'm very confident that we are exactly on the right way here, on the right road, and that we will deliver this in time. And I have also to acknowledge that the Commission is also giving us a framework supporting this. There were questions how to accelerate moving technologies to the required technology readiness levels. I think that is also one thing we are addressing in this cooperation. Why did I say three-quarters good or semi-positive? Because with all respect, we could have started earlier. We knew that this would come. And this is the lesson learned. I think this part of the discussion was about functionalities. I think we need a much more intense discussion if we want to address the speed issue, a proactive discussion. What new features, functionalities do we expect from the grid in order to have all the things ready? And we need to do that together. And there are other examples. So I mentioned before what is typical for the coming power systems is that we will have concentrations of generation distributed across the continent. What I did not yet mention is these concentration of generation will vary over time, depending on the availability of the primary energy. And that's a big difference to traditional concentrated generation assets. I think the best known traditional one is bulk hydro, where you usually could assume it delivers all over the time and you have a relatively stable load flow situation. With these future systems, we will not have that anymore. I call it, we have migrating generation peaks, which means transmission networks need to be able to accommodate much more different load flow situations, and that requires more flexible assets, and that has to do a lot with reactive power provision, also in the AC, but particularly in the AC world. Reactive power is an AC phenomena. And we need to proactively develop the networks in this direction. So we need to have this technology discussion among operators, technology providers, and also regulators before the problem has occurred. And that is what I mean by, and then we need to make it happen, because the reactive approach we used to have in network development is too slow for the speed of the transition. That's what I meant in my initial statement. Speed will change the approach.
Maybe, Jochen, that very point that you're saying, I mean, about we should have started earlier. And there is a question here on the chat, which is very timely on that, and maybe for Jan as well. Who should be responsible of organizing this offshore grid development? I mean, who takes the leadership? Who should be taking the leadership and saying that, okay, let's sit down, let's discuss, let's map it out? Any views?
Well, I'm not sure if it's so easy to define one party who would take the whole responsibility. I think actually the responsibility would need to be shared. And as mentioned before, I think the network development process should be transparent and inclusive. So inclusive meaning, of course, that it involves a wide variety of stakeholders, where things are transparently expressed and discussed and then evaluated before a joint decision is then taken on what is the most appropriate way forward. But this is all very, theoretical, and it's not that easy to implement in real life. So we'll see how it goes. We have the 10-year revision happening as we speak, basically. So maybe some changes will happen there in that direction. We'll see that. But yeah, for now, I definitely agree with Johan that things need to change if we want to be on par with this accelerated need for new infrastructure. Definitely.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm gonna change slightly the topic now. There was a paper, Norella, recently also published by NSOI about the investment framework. And there's been a lot of statements out there also from different associations, including Wind Europe and Current, saying that we need to move the investment framework towards a TOTEX-based approach, where you reward overall system cost and not only you don't only reward based on the investments, but you include also all the operational expenses and potential savings. So it seems there is agreement in the sector that we need to move to that regulatory framework. And so my question would be, how far are we from that? And if we are not there yet, what are the main challenges to get into that situation?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I cover different fields, and probably here Jan will have a more direct view on how far we can get and how we should take this approach further. So, of course, the move towards TOTEX is given by the fact that we have to become more flexible. And I think together with Acer, actually, we discussed more informally the uptake of other solutions than those who are pure Capex and traditional ones. So there are a set of smart solutions around, and I think we worked upon, which of course will probably not be as intensive in terms of returns or in terms of revenues as the capex. And from here, of course, the idea of moving towards TOTEX, so including also the operational expenses, because today certain investments which I would say maybe take place in these smart solutions, they are done through also through operational expenses. So there are, of course, certain countries which I think they move. Probably I will give the example of Netherlands, for example. They move in that direction with a certain within a certain framework. But what I think it's important, it's of course to manage actually to incentivize the move towards this uptake of these smart solutions. These incentives, of course, they have to fulfill certain requirements because, yeah, we have to base this on a rather transparent framework, which was mentioned by Jochen and by Jan before. However, it needs to remain simple and measurable, to be easy to be implemented. Then, of course, fairness and stability, controllability and flexibility for the future. So I think in addition to the TOTEX, we have to discuss also this incentives framework, which might be needed in order to put in place this type of move towards the use of smart solutions.
Thanks. Jan, how do you see that? Do we actually have the right investment framework? Do we really need to do this shift to this TOTEX? And what do you see as main obstacles or advantages as well of that?
Yeah, I think Norella, you know my position here. and I would guess also many of the participants with whom I had the pleasure of discussing it. I think it's not all about the TOTEX, right? Because the issue behind TOTEX, or this move to TOTEX, is the so-called Capex bias. So where you have the regulated entity being rewarded a specific rate of return for Capex, but not for OPEX. In those cases, of course, this Capex bias persists, and then, of course, moving towards a TOTEX regime could solve those very specific cases where that happens. But I think that the even bigger problem is the comparably lower TOTEX, if you call it. Let's say that we solve this issue of the Capex bias. Let's say we incentivize equally OPEX and Capex. Let's say we do not distinguish between the two. And then, but we distinguish between, of course, very high cost solutions and comparably lower cost solutions. So you have a smart solution which aims to achieve something through software upgrades, whatever, some smart technology. And on the other hand, you have a classical infrastructure solution, building new lines and so on. I mean, these two, to some extent, compete, right? We're not saying that we believe that there is any smart technology out there that could fully substitute in building new lines. Of course, that is still definitely necessary. But what we believe is that the regulatory framework for such low-cost investments should definitely change, because the absolute return on a low-cost investment is many times lower, of course, compared to the high-cost investment. So in a rate of return regulation, which is, I think, throughout the world, the only one really recognized, that cannot really work, because in a rate of return regulation, high cost solutions are favored by the regulated entities, or at least from a business perspective, it makes sense that they are favored. Even though we see many TSOs doing a very good job in innovating and doing things like that. So when we talk about innovation, we have to not only talk about innovation, but the actual implementation of innovative solutions on a wide scale. Not only pilot projects and then doing innovative things, but when you come to a good solution, then you should implement it widely. And why we at least believe that this is not being done is the problem of the rate of return regulatory frameworks, which should shift from looking only at the cost side of the problem towards also looking at the benefit side of the problem. So for those really lower cost solutions, there should be an option. We are discussing it now with the NRAs. There should be an option of perhaps sharing to some extent the benefits obtained through the implementation of such projects between of course, the project promoter, if you call it that, mostly, I don't know, TSOs, DSOs, and so on, and of course the other network users on the other hand. So everybody would actually benefit from it. And by doing that, you would also stimulate innovation, because an innovation with a very specific goal of reaching or giving benefits to the end consumers. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jan. Would you like to add something on that, Johan?
Yeah, a short one. First of all, I can only support this. I think we need such a discussion on where we see problems and how to address them, problems in the framework. And I think the most important thing, and that connects very nicely to what has been said before, is in order to achieve what. So where are we missing something, and what should we do to improve that? And here I would like to add one dimension of this discussion, which we have also observed as technology provider. One of the first, Aurelia, if I make it very short, said, the flexibility everybody is talking about will automatically mean more OPEX. And agree, there is a direct link. This is a natural thing, so we simply need to be aware. This is a natural technical consequence, and we have to deal with this. There is another thing, coming back to my overall topic of speed. If we want to mobilize as many players contributing to this transition, then it may also make sense to think to open the door for services that could be sourced by the network operators rather than doing all by themselves. And don't get me wrong, I don't say that the one or the other is better. I only said we should open the door, because the more doors we have open, the bigger the likelihood is that the best solution will be found. And the Capex biased regulation, of course, also prevents companies from sourcing out, because that is very often a transformation of Capex into OPEX, which is a means the rest of the industry regularly uses. So it can't be totally wrong, I would say. So opening the door for such services would also help to mobilize more actors. And again, it's about speed. The more we have offering the help, the more likely we will make it. We will make it. So that's an additional dimension.
Well, thanks a lot, Johan. And it's also quite reassuring to hear that Acer is looking into this and trying to find a mechanism that will better reward, let's say, the benefits that those investments bring, and not only the volume of the investments. Maybe another point, perhaps the last one, and I invite everyone, if there's still questions or comments, please use the chat for that. It's about the system development plans. Coming a little bit back to the original or the starting point. We say that we have a plan, but we're not building enough. We talk about social acceptance. We talk about transparency on the CBAs. We talk about well, permitting. Obviously, it's a big issue as well. Yeah, you don't get the permits fast enough. Now, maybe the question is, okay, we have a plan, and so if we all agree on a plan, it should be rather straightforward. Okay, let's do it. But perhaps there is also a degree of, well, we do not all agree on the plan, or the plan is becoming that complex that we see a lot of uncertainties. As I give you an example, now ETIPWind it has a joint scenario with ENSO-G, so ENSO-E and ENSO-E. So now you bring a degree of complexity, different solutions. So you have now more solutions, and I think you mentioned it, Jan. Why not repurposing a gas infrastructure, which might not be so efficient, but it will remove public acceptance, so it could be faster. So then we find a situation in which actually we try always to say what is the optimal solution, but there are so many options that there are so many opinions. Is that a real issue? Is that actually delaying the transition? And if yes, how do you think we can overcome this, and how can we make this overall process at the European level, but I think also national level, more efficient? And that's for you, Jan.
Yeah, I mean, that's again very, very good question. I think my answer would be very similar to how I answered one of the previous questions. I think the first foundation needs to be laid in the sense of trust, meaning that the entities most involved in all of this decision making here, if we call it like that, need to find ways of agreeing and not arguing amongst each other. I think this is very important, and this is also, of course, a major issue of trust. If we see transparency, if we see, inclusivity and all that aspects being tackled, then I think it's much easier to trust the results here. But once again, I would like to emphasize that we are now moving towards system integration on a totally new level, because system integration in terms of network planning, integrating to some extent gas and electricity. I mean, these are just two quite well defined networks, which with two very known energy carriers, which we tried to integrate. We did some work on it. Were we fully successful? I don't think we were completely successful. We did do quite a lot of work, but not fully completed it. But now we see the huge need of new players coming in. So we see the huge need of hydrogen. We see also other things that are very important here. So a very holistic view should be taken here. And this is very, very different, because you do not have one entity encompassing all of these knowledge, let's say. So you need to discuss with different stakeholders who, of course, have their own objectives. So this is it's going to be very difficult to juggle all of this at the end. So definitely not an easy task, but yeah, I think we need to definitely push forward. We need to go beyond just building new lines. We need to go beyond just, you know, trying to see what to do with the gas infrastructure. We need to look at, I don't know, demand side management. We need to look at smart technologies. We need to look as broad as we can. I think this is very much in line with what Johan said, that the more options you open the door to, the most likely the better the outcome is at the end, the more efficient the outcome is. But I don't have a magic solution to this. At the end, even if we, you know, all of us manage to agree on something, which would be a miracle, I think, and say, yes, that is the optimal way forward, you would still have maybe, you know, the public saying no to that. And that's another big obstacle that many times we, I think, forget about until we are there trying to build an actual line, for example, and then you have public opposition. That public acceptance should start from the very beginning. So again, trust is a very big issue, but you have to teach the public. I think from I don't know, primary school onwards, you would need to teach them. I mean, this is a project which will not end in 5 years. This is a project which will, you know, go on for many decades. And then we need to teach the people in general what are the complexities here, and what is the need, yeah, of, you know, for example, building a transmission line which may not directly serve your individual purpose, but serves a bigger European goal. And all of these, you know, are huge steps to make in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So indeed, multi-stakeholder coordination and keep the doors open, as Johan was saying. Johan, anything to add also on how do we keep those doors open and we have these talks going on and moving forward? You are muted, Johan.
Indeed. So I like very much when Jan said, well, even if we agree on a process, would be a miracle, because I think we should be. This is a very important point. I don't think that anybody has the solution that we can agree on at the moment for this transition. And to acknowledge that this is an exceptional time where we have to challenge and to everything that we were used to and have tried to learn jointly is the first step. So whenever we talking about, for instance, a system development plan, which we are discussing now, we should not interpret that meaning we will now have to thoroughly discuss and then we agree how to do it. And then we know it and then we execute. That would have been the traditional approach, which was very well suiting to the situation we were used to over decades, but we will not do that in one step. So we need to agree that we have to organize a learning process with regular reviews, with exchanges, and the willingness to change more or less everything if we see the necessity, including frameworks. And there is a dependency between the frameworks, the processes, even the organization of the industry, and what we want to achieve. So that's the first important thing, and I'm very happy to sense a broad consensus about that here. A particular comment on system development. So we heard about sector integration already, which I believe is a big challenge because somehow it's also a moving target. We know that we need to have to shift the borders between the traditional sectors, but we have a, well, I would call it a pretty big unknown, the development of hydrogen technology, which has strong implications for moving this border and the speed how that will be done. So we have to deal with that. But there is also another piece in system view. We also need to understand that transforming power systems from systems that were primarily operated on transmission level, operated in the sense of balancing load and generation, to a system where the vast majority of the operational assets will be connected to the distribution level, but still need to be coordinated on transmission level, will require a different view, a more holistic view on system operation, including TSOs and DSOs. And we have the TSO-DSO cooperation platform as a first step in that direction, but we also, we had the pleasure to be invited to some of the meetings recently. We all, because of developing of functionalities and smartness, And we recognized also that we are in the beginning here to understand what this means. And I'm quoting network operators here saying we need to develop a joint vision how this system will be operated in future. So this is another dimension which we have to add to the existing challenges. It's a very fundamental change we're in, and we are still operating the system in the traditional way. We still have the bulk power plants, but we all know that's not forever.
Thank you, Johan. Norella, you and actually NSOE is at the center of all these talks and this cooperation. You have the TYNDP, but also this TSO, DSO cooperation that Johan is referring to. So maybe your final thoughts on this before I close the session and I give back the floor to Adrian for closing remarks.
I think it was said. So we have this cross-sector dimension, which was mentioned before. So with the gas, but also with the hydrogen. Not to mention even another challenge which is coming. I think the electromobility and in general the electrification. So on the heating sector. So being for different demands in residential or in the industrial sector, which I think was mentioned before by Johan, which is happening also in this decade. So we thought that is going to happen after 2030, but we need to align before so that, for example, the electromobility doesn't develop completely on its way without, for example, taking into account the smart charging. So this is about the sector integration. And of course, this I will call it cross-sector. And then this vertical integration on the electricity chain, which is with the DSOs, and also with the evolution of the demand as well. So uncertainty of the demand and variability of the demand, in addition to the variability of the supply. So where we meet and how we develop actually this grid to take into account this dynamic evolution on both sides, which is becoming more and more complex. And then, of course, the TSOs, this is the cross-border dimension, which still remains, I think, important in order to manage a pan-European system.
Thanks a lot for that, Norella, Johan, and Jan. Many thanks for staying with us and sharing your expert thoughts. With that, I would like to give you the floor back, Adrian.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks also from my side for all the speakers here that presented today. And thanks to you and Vasiliki for helping in moderating and setting up the session here. We are right on time. Apologies for not having enough breaks, but I hope it was an interesting discussion for all of you. Just a few notes that I put down here on paper, as we have spent 3 hours here debating on how we get the European grid fit for the 55 package. So I think we all see the ambition is there, and there is buy-in, right, to get that ambition, and the plans are really made. Electricity is at the center of these plans, right? And as a backbone for a carbon neutral system, there is also a discussion about how we do with the other energy sectors and say cross-sector integration. But what was really standing out today, it is the sense of urgency, and the sense of urgency of getting things done, really. And start to accelerate, right, this transition that we have here. Of course, all stakeholders need to participate with know-how, but also need to contribute, open the door for many of them to be part of the transition, not only with advising it, but also with providing services, with providing technology solutions as being part of the entire evolution of the power system in Europe. Public acceptance is part of removing some of the roadblockers there. With earlier we start, the better it is. With more we educate, with more we spread the word why and what are the benefits across for all Europeans, the more understood this is, right? At the same time, we also need to look at and be more innovative of how we are deploying our technology such that we are not disrupting communities too much. And then part of all this, coming back to processes, it was once again highlighted the need for accelerated permitting, get the paperwork faster, put the projects on ground and deliver them to be there. To be more visionary from where we are, right, and how we deploy them, we also need to be more proactive on the required functionality and prepare the next solutions in the R&D and the technology development, such that we are sustaining properly the development of the transition here, right? HVDC and HVDC grids was mentioned quite a bit. The need for being meshed, the need to be interoperable and make it as simple as AC from a technology standpoint, from a solution delivery standpoint, but also from an understanding of those that are dealing with them, they are operating and so on. And then we also discussed about flexibility and the need for many assets to contribute in this and keep the security of supply, keep the high reliability of the power system there. And as we are also, stepping into electrification of many sectors, power electronics as a technology becomes very important. It can hold so many functionality into that. We saw also from Nikos how we detail it from wind turbines, what could be the provision of functionality in the future, but the same will be for e-mobility, vehicle to grid, bidirectional charging, discharging, and contribution that, but it's also beyond the electrical assets, also in other sectors. I only can hope, right, that was a well-spent 3 hours. You have learned a lot, indeed interesting discussions here. Thanks a lot from my side and from the entire ETIPWind and Wind Europe team here, and we are looking forward to seeing you at the next event. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian.